Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're setting the GPS for South Carolina, not just to check out the music scene there, but really to track a fascinating story.
Yeah, it's one of those stories about, like, musical self-destruction, but also radical reinvention.
Uh,
Pretty compelling stuff.
exactly. We're unpacking this, well, almost violent transformation of a group of musicians. They had regional success, but then it seems like they found their whole identity fundamentally flawed.
It's way more than just a rebrand, isn't it? It
Yeah.
feels more like an artistic exorcism, like you said.
Right.
We're tracing the journey of Sequoyah Prep School, a band that was working, they were successful as a folk rock act, and then looking at that specific moment, that philosophical choice that basically forced them to just erase that identity.
And then reemerge, right, spiritually, artistically renewed as this other band, Susto, who are now critically acclaimed.
That's the core mission for us today, yeah. Understanding the why behind this really dramatic, high-stakes shift.
And our sources, thankfully, give us some pretty precise details. We've got info on the musical influences, the timelines, and importantly, the really profound dramatic language they use to explain the break itself.
Which is key.
And the link, the through line connecting these two completely distinct eras is the bandleader, Justin Osborne. He's the central figure here.
Definitely. He's at the heart of this story, which is really defined by rejecting the past in favor of finding some kind of deeper truth.
So we have the data, basically, to map this whole transformation from that geographically specific, kind of hard to define folk rock sound of SPS back in the early 2000s.
Right.
To the much more focused contemporary indie rock and Americana sound that STO has today.
And I'd like to really get the pivot. We have to start by looking at what they were actually leaving behind. So let's dive into the foundation, into Sequoyah Prep School first.
Okay, let's unpack this first chapter then. Sequoyah Prep School, or SPS, they got started pretty early, 2003, and based out of Atlanta, South Carolina. Atlanta, I mean, that's a small town, right? It feels pretty far removed from the big music industry hubs. What does that specific location tell us?
Well, that geographical base is pretty telling, I think. Atlanta isn't Charleston. It's definitely not Nashville or Austin.
Right.
Starting there kind of roots them firmly in the rural Southeast. And that often means you develop this local, really organic following first, driven by, touring the regional circuits, word of mouth.
Before maybe getting any major industry attention.
Exactly. It suggests a very grassroots, probably hardworking beginning, digging in locally.
Okay, so let's look at the band's lineup, the roster. Because right away we hit this little contradiction, which maybe speaks to how things get documented for early indie bands.
Ah, yeah.
What's that? Well, the source material describes SPS as a 5-piece band, but then it lists 6 members.
Oh, interesting.
Justin Osborne, Harrison Boyd, Wes Jones, Jordan Hicks, Joel Ivy, and Johnny Matthews. 6 names, but described as 5 pieces. What do we make of that little inconsistency?
That's a good point. It does raise questions about, clarity in the early days of a regional band like that.
Yeah.
It could suggest maybe a fluid lineup.
Yeah.
Perhaps one member stepped away right when that description was being finalized, or maybe they had slightly different lineups for live shows versus studio stuff.
Could be.
It's hard to say for sure. But either way, the 6 names confirm it was a substantial group, a pretty active unit, and Osborne is clearly the front man, but he's surrounded by these versatile musicians.
Definitely. And what really defines this initial phase, maybe more than the personnel, is the sound itself. They got labeled as having a unique style, trying to combine folk, rock, and alternative influences, which the source says ultimately led to a sound that was, quote, a hard-to-define genre.
And that difficulty in pinning them down, that's actually critical, I think.
How sad.
Because when you look at the influences they actually cited, you see exactly why they were hard to categorize. On one hand, they pulled really heavily from that big, polished 1990s rock sound.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Matchbox 20, Counting Crows, Third Eye Blind. Think about that. Sound-earnest vocals, big guitars, kind of polished production. That radio-friendly adult alternative vibe.
Okay, I can hear that. Big sound.
But then they brought in this totally different force, these deep folk roots. And they specifically cited Old Crow Medicine Show.
Ah, okay. So we're talking about that more raw, traditional, sometimes rough around the edges, Appalachian folk sound, famous for, wagon wheel.
Exactly. That's the tension that defined SPS. You had the commercial polish and that sort of emotional introspection of post-grunge alt-rock.
Yeah.
Trying to mesh with the raw, acoustic authenticity of Americana.
So that blend meant they didn't sound quite like anyone else, right? But maybe it also meant they lacked that immediate punch of a pure genre band. Like you couldn't instantly say, oh, they're that.
Precisely. It gave them uniqueness, but maybe less clarity for listeners or industry folks trying to pigeonhole them.
Well, whatever they were doing, it definitely clicked with people pretty quickly. This hard-to-define blend, it found traction fast, at least in the regional scene.
It did. In 2005, they were actually declared the #1 unsigned band in South Carolina.
Wow.
By the online music industry, apparently. That's a pretty massive endorsement back then. Validates what they were doing.
Absolutely significant, especially thinking about 2005. That was peak MySpace era, right? Pre-major label hype being the only way.
Totally. And speaking of that era, their success is just completely tied up with MySpace. Their commercial highlights, the source notes, are directly linked to how powerful that platform was for music discovery then. There are songs about rain and hurricane.
Yeah.
They racked up over 800,000 plays just on MySpace.
800,000 on MySpace. That's incredible for that time. That wasn't just local buzz. That was serious digital reach. Building a real fan base beyond radio or anything.
Exactly. And that online momentum, it clearly translated into actual sales, too.
Okay.
Their most popular release seems to be the 2008 album Ghost Town. Reportedly sold over 20,000 copies in the first year.
20,000 copies. For an unsigned or very indie band back then, before streaming really took over sales. That's substantial. That's real money. Real artistic achievement.
Oh, yeah. They weren't just some local curiosity playing bars. They were a commercially viable act.
And you can see that dual nature, the folk rock blend, reflected perfectly in the instruments they were using, too. It wasn't just like they added a banjo player occasionally.
No, the instrumentation details really give you the technical fingerprint of their sound.
Right.
Justin Osborne, he wasn't just the singer.
Right.
He also played acoustic guitar, mandolin, and piano.
Mandolin.
And then Wes Jones handled guitar, vocals, banjo, and piano. So the mandolin and the banjo, that's the literal folk texture.
Yeah, layered right onto the standard rock setup.
Exactly. They had the core rock tools, but they also had the texture and that acoustic feel of Americana baked right in. It shows the genre blend wasn't accidental. It was built into how they played.
So their active years stretched for, what, nearly a decade? From starting in 2003 up to their last release mentioned, a single called Spells in 2011.
Yeah, a good run. And during that time, they were definitely a touring machine.
Yeah.
Hitting the Southeast, obviously, but also the Northeast and the Midwest.
Getting out there.
Constantly on the road. And look at who they shared stages with. It's incredibly diverse. You've got Anne Boleyn, who are like a major alternative rockamo act. They're Better Than Ezra, classic 90s rock. And then also roots guys like Corey Smith.
Wow, that is diverse.
It really confirms that their hard-to-define sound actually worked across different audiences.
Yeah.
It was versatile enough to fit on different bills. Truly cross-genre.
And anchored in places like the New Brooklyn Tavern in Columbia, South Carolina, which is kind of a legendary venue down there, right? Solidifying that regional legacy.
Definitely. They put in the work, built a real following.
Okay, so we've got this picture. A successful band, established regionally, selling albums, big online numbers, almost a decade of touring under their belt, real momentum.
Yep, they'd achieved something significant.
Then we hit this huge narrative turn. And this is where the story shifts from, musical success to something more like existential crisis.
Right. That jump from having commercial success to suddenly expressing this profound self-doubt.
Yeah.
That's honestly the most intriguing part of this whole deep dive for me.
Yeah.
And it starts simply enough. The band took an 8-month break in 2010.
Okay. Bands take breaks.
But this wasn't just a standard, let's recharge, write some new songs kind of break. The source material's really explicit here.
How so?
This time off was used for deep, thematic and philosophical self-reflection, and apparently driven primarily by Osborne.
Okay. In the language they use to describe this reflection, this is where it gets intense. It stops being about just music and starts sounding almost like, morality.
Yeah.
They apparently engaged in looking back on what's described as a life of sin.
Right. A life of sin.
Wait, hang on. A successful folk rock band touring the Southeast is looking back at their run and calling it a life of sin. That's an incredibly severe way to frame it.
It's extremely high-stakes language, isn't it? It suggests this massive gap had opened up between their public success and how the core artists felt internally, privately.
But why? Why would the music itself, this polished folk rock blend, be considered sinful? What does that even mean in this context?
That's the million-dollar question. Perhaps, and this is just speculation based on the shift that followed, perhaps that polished radio-friendly side, the 90s rock influence they embodied, maybe that started to feel inauthentic or too commercially compromising compared to the raw Americana side they also clearly loved.
So the art itself, or maybe the lifestyle that came with promoting that art, became the sin.
It seems like it.
Yeah.
And if the music and the touring life were viewed that negatively, then the need for radical change becomes much clearer, artistically speaking.
Yeah, it sets the stage. And this identity crisis, it really climaxes with this incredibly dramatic statement that the source highlights, that they had, quote, entered the darkness and can no longer return.
Mm-hmm.
That's not just rebranding talk. That sounds like a public declaration of some kind of foundational trauma or irreversible change.
That statement absolutely serves as the explicit, super dramatic catalyst for everything that follows. It implies that the path they took as Sequoyah Prep School led them somewhere they ultimately found untenable, or maybe even morally corrupting from their perspective.
Like they felt they crossed some line.
Yeah, exactly. They crossed the threshold, and the only way forward was to just completely abandon the vehicle, the band identity that took them there.
This level of self-criticism, it almost makes the band sound less like a business and more like, I don't know, the subject of a morality play or something.
It really does frame it that way.
So what was the practical outcome of this intense internal conviction? What did they actually do?
Well, the result was this conscious, very purposeful effort to, quote, dissociate themselves with the music produced when they were called Sequoyah Prep School.
Dissociate themselves. Think about what that means. It's huge. They were actively rejecting their most popular songs, their biggest successes, their established name and identity.
That's a staggering business decision, even before you get to the philosophical weight of it.
Yeah.
You sell 20,000 albums, you have 800,000 plays building an audience,
Right.
and you consciously say, nope, we reject all that.
Yeah.
You risk alienating your entire original fan base
Yeah.
and giving up potentially significant income from that back catalog. Why take such a drastic, almost punitive step?
It seems because the philosophical need, the need for a clean break, just completely outweighed the commercial risk for them, or at least for Osborne.
The darkness was too real.
Apparently, for them, the name SPS and its music were just intrinsically linked to that life of sin. So to achieve whatever artistic redemption or clarity they were seeking, they had to declare that past identity dead. Finished.
So the dissociation makes the next step, the new band SUSO, seem not just like an evolution, but like a necessary rebirth, a cleansing. Exactly. It transforms what could have just been a name change into this really profound statement about the connection between your personal ethics and what you create artistically. So emerging from that self-declared darkness, this new identity starts to form. The band Susto, often in all caps, SUSTO, began their activities around 2013-2014, so a couple of years after that SPS hiatus.
Right.
And now based in Charleston, South Carolina.
Okay, so we see a time shift, but also a geographical one. They moved from Atlanta, that small town, to Charleston.
Mm-hmm.
Charleston's a much bigger cultural hub, right? Especially for Americana, roots music, that kind of scene. Does that move seem strategic, like reflecting a new focus?
Oh, absolutely. I think so.
Yeah.
The move to Charleston signals a kind of professional maturation, maybe.
How do you mean?
Well, they're now embedding themselves right in the city with a really robust contemporary music scene.
Yeah.
A scene that's known for being friendly to exactly the genres they were moving towards, Americana and indie rock.
So it helps them shed that maybe limiting regional folk rock tag from the Atlanta days?
Yeah, and enter a broader, maybe more sophisticated cultural conversation. It positions them differently.
And the name itself, SUSTO. This provides that ultimate aha moment, doesn't it? I feel like it directly justifies all the philosophical drama of the break we just talked about.
It really does. The name, SUTO, it's the Spanish word, meaning an intense fear, understood as a condition of the soul.
Wow. I mean, that perfectly encapsulates the whole crisis narrative, right?
It's actually brilliant branding if you think about it purely on that level.
Yeah.
Because it creates this direct thematic link back to that identity trauma. If they enter the darkness as SPS,
Yeah.
the new band, SUSTO, is literally named after the condition that crisis created. It's like saying, okay, that intense fear, that spiritual unease, the susto that's now the central subject of our art, we're not going to ignore it or cover it up with polished rock anymore.
And the source adds a little more texture, too, noting the name also had some derivation from Cuban roots and even letters within Justin Osborne's own name.
Right, which adds these layers of personal, maybe spiritual, cultural significance. It grounds the new identity not just in a big philosophical concept, but ties it right back to the band leader's own identity and maybe heritage. It makes it feel very intentional.
Very personal.
Yeah. And crucially, this new identity came with a much clearer sound, a clearer stylistic definition.
Okay.
STU is defined pretty clearly as an American indie rock band, but also incorporating Americana and alt country.
So that resolves that old SPS problem of being hard to define.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They seem to have found their lane by taking those folk elements they clearly loved the Americana part and synthesizing them with a more contemporary approach, the indie rock edge. It's a clearer target.
Now let's talk about continuity, because even though this was framed as this huge philosophical break, it wasn't a total clean slate with personnel, right? Osborne's still the main guy.
Yes, he's the central visionary providing that continuity.
But there was at least one other key member shared between the bands, which proves this new thing was still built on an existing foundation.
Yeah, that's an important detail. Jordan Hicks. He was listed as a versatile player back in SBS guitar, banjo, vocals.
Right, the banjo especially.
And the source explicitly notes he was a past member of SDO2.
Okay, so why is that vital?
Because Hicks represents that specific technical continuity. The banjo, that folk sensibility, it wasn't just discarded. It wasn't thrown out with the bathwater.
I see.
It was just repurposed, given a new context within the STO framework. So it wasn't really a rejection of the sound entirely, maybe, but more the meaning or the associations tied to that sound back in the SBS days.
Gotcha. The tools were kept, but the mission changed.
Something like that. And the current roster seems to solidify STO as a cohesive unit now. Justin Osborne, Marshall Hudson, Kevin Early, Johnny Delaware, and Ian Clean.
And importantly, this new structure, this new identity, it seems to have quickly led to much more prolific output and definitely greater industry visibility than SPS ever achieved.
The trajectory is pretty steep, yeah.
Yeah.
They put out their self-titled debut in 2014. That was on Hearts and Plugs, which is a solid local regional label in Charleston.
Okay.
But then look at the label progression after that. It really demonstrates how quickly they ascended and got validated within that American indie world. They moved to Missing Piece Records and Acid Boys for their second album, And I'm Fine Today, in 2017.
And then came a really significant step up, one that anyone following this kind of music would recognize. They signed with Rounder Records for Ever Since I Lost My Mind in 2019.
Yeah.
What does signing to Rounder specifically signal in this context? Americana, alt country, Rounder's a big name, right?
Oh, Rounder's a huge signifier. It's one of those respected, most storied labels in American roots music, period. Often associated with Grammy winners, genre legends.
So that move instantly does what? Lifts them up.
It instantly validated Susto's commitment to authentic Americana and alt country. It lifted them from being maybe a cool regional indie band to having serious national industry credibility. It confirmed they weren't that hard to define local rock band anymore. They were serious players in the roots genre.
Okay, huge step. And they kept that momentum going, didn't they? Eventually moving to New West Records.
Yeah, for Time in the Sun in 2021 and then My Entire Life in 2023.
And New West is another powerhouse label in that contemporary Americana and roots rock world.
Absolutely. So it confirms this really calculated strategic progression through high-caliber, genre-appropriate labels. They weren't just randomly signing deals. They were moving up the ladder within their chosen scene.
And creatively, they're still going strong. It shows the new identity is sustainable. My Entire Life was their 5th studio album just last year, 2023.
Right. And they're already prepping another release, apparently a more niche-focused one called Susto String Band, Volume 1, slated for 2025.
Interesting string band.
Yeah, it shows they're not only prolific, but actively exploring those acoustic Americana textures even deeper within the STO sound, really leaning into it.
And all this increased visibility, it also translated into playing bigger stages, major festivals.
Definitely. The source mentions them playing the High Water Festival, which is right there in North Charleston in 2018. Makes sense geographically.
Yeah.
But also, crucially, the South by Southwest Festival, SSSW, down in Austin, Texas in 2019.
And playing SXSW that's kind of a rite of passage, isn't it?
It's huge. It's a strategic necessity, really, for any band seeking national, even international exposure. It's where the industry, the media, thousands of fans all converge.
So that performance really solidifies their status as a national level act, a buzzworthy band.
Exactly. It demonstrates that this really profound personal shift from SPS to Susto ultimately resulted in undeniable commercial and critical elevation for them. The gamble paid off.
Okay, so now we have the full arc of the shift laid out. Let's circle back and actually look at the music itself, the discographies side by side.
Okay.
Because the lyrical themes, the song titles, This feels like the most concrete evidence of that shift we've been talking about. From SPS's perceived life of sin to Esto really exploring that condition of the soul.
Absolutely. This is where you really see the change manifest. So starting back with Sequoyah Prep School, they had 3 main studio albums listed. Weights Are Heavy in 2005.
Okay.
We Said Hello in 2008. And also Ghost Town in 2008.
The titles themselves, Weights Are Heavy, Ghost Town, they kind of lean into that introspective, maybe slightly dramatic, emotional vibe of early 2000s rock, don't they?
They do. Weights Are Heavy. It feels classic, earnest, maybe a bit vaguely angsty.
Yeah, emo adjacent, maybe.
Yeah.
And if we look at some specific track names from SBS, the picture gets even clearer. We've got About Rain, Hurricane. Okay, weather themes. Sensibility.
Interesting. Literary reference.
Right, feels sort of safe, emotionally grounded in that 90s rock storytelling style. Then Holy City and Lucille.
Holy City, likely referring to Charleston or the area, a bit of local pride maybe. But overall, lyrically, SPS seemed to be operating in a pretty recognizable tradition.
Meaning?
Writing about love, loss, the weather, maybe some local references, but without really pushing into overtly provocative or like confrontational theological territory.
Right. They were a successful band writing solid, accessible folk rock songs, nothing inherently sinful looking from the outside, you know.
Exactly. But the contrast, when you pivot to Susto singles and album titles, it's seismic. It's immediate.
Yeah.
This is where the band just explicitly delivers on the promise of that Sustum identity. The themes immediately jump to this very explicit, often kind of irreverent or darkly humorous engagement with faith, doubt, God, the darkness they mentioned.
Okay, give me an example. This is where the depth really lies, like you said.
Okay, consider this single title.
Yeah.
Chillin' on the Beach with My Best Friend, Jesus Christ, released in 2016.
Wow.
Now, compare that directly to an SBS title like Sense and Sensibility.
Worlds apart. One is polite, literary, observational, maybe. The other is shocking, casual. It's this juxtaposition of the most sacred figure imaginable, Jesus Christ, with the totally mundane image of chilling on a beach.
Exactly. It feels like a complete thematic liberation. The titles themselves become confrontational. They challenge your expectations. They seem to embrace the complexity, the messiness of faith and doubt, rather than hiding it behind safer, more vague emotional language.
And that continues, right. There was another single, Hyperbolic Jesus, that came out before the My Entire Life album in 2023.
Yes. Even the language itself feels more sophisticated, maybe a bit satirical, using a word like hyperbolic to talk about theological ideas.
So these songs, these titles, they directly fulfill that journey. Osborne started with the whole life of sin reflection back in 2010.
It really seems like it. They're taking those intensely personal, maybe spiritual conflicts and turning them directly into their art, the repeatable commercial art.
The new music just isn't afraid to ask tough questions or be irreverent or get deeply personal about that search for meaning, huh?
That's exactly how it feels. And even the STO album titles, like And I'm Fine Today, with that sort of implicit qualifier, or Ever Since I Lost My Mind in My Entire Life. They all suggest a much wider scope of psychological, maybe spiritual exploration than the earlier, more contained SPS titles like Weights Are Heavy.
Yeah, the scale feels bigger. And we also see their commitment to the live show reflected in STO's output too, right? They've released live albums.
Yeah, things like live from the Australian Country Music Hall of Fame back in 2015 and more recently live from Codfish Hollow in 2024. It demonstrates that the STO sound isn't just a studio creation, it's robust and translates effectively live.
Okay, so when we put it all together, when we synthesize this whole journey, it seems clear the break wasn't just about changing the style slightly. It felt like a philosophical necessity for them.
I think that's right. The original band, SBS, was a success, sure, built on that kind of hard-to-define mix of polished 90s rock and traditional folk.
But the core musicians, they kept some essential elements, didn't they? The acoustic guitar, the banjo, the piano, thanks to guys like Hicks staying on initially and Osborne leading.
Exactly. The tools remained.
Right.
But the context for those tools fundamentally shifted.
Also?
Well, that instrumentation, it was redirected. Instead of serving the sort of emotional, maybe radio-friendly folk rock of SPS, it started providing the starker, more textured backdrop for Susto's intense thematic focus, that spiritual fear, that existential searching.
So they moved from just blending styles to landing in this more mature American indie space, where the genre is defined as much by the depth of the subject matter, the Susto itself, as by the instruments being played.
Well put, yeah. The ultimate conclusion, I think, is that this whole transition just powerfully demonstrates the role of self-evaluation, even harsh self-criticism, in art. That foundational break, that feeling of needing to abandon a past they deemed sinful. It paradoxically allowed Osborne and the group to settle into a sound that's arguably far more defined, more articulate, and ultimately more commercially respected as Susto.
So they found clarity by actually embracing the crisis, the darkness.
It seems that way. The journey really proves that sometimes, maybe to find your truest sound, to really define your artistic space, you first have to confront and maybe even document the murky parts of your own personal history.
And then commit to using that darkness, that complexity, as your primary source material going forward. Hashtag tag outro. Wow, what a deep dive that was. Into artistic reinvention, conviction, maybe even redemption in a way.
It really covers a lot of ground.
Yeah.
We've traced this evolution from Sequoyah Prep School, successful but apparently deeply self-critical, to Susto, who are critically respected, prolific, and seem much more comfortable in their own skin, musically and thematically.
Yeah, it really is an exemplary case of how an identity crisis, that feeling of being on the wrong path, can actually fuel a creative and ultimately successful breakthrough.
And if we zoom out and look at the bigger picture here,
Yeah.
it raises this really essential question for any artist, any creative person or entity, really.
It is.
When an established identity gets discarded, when do you know if it's just a strategic rebrand, fresh coat of paint, new logo, versus when it's a genuine, necessary declaration like we saw here? That feeling of having entered the darkness and can no longer return, which demands a complete artistic and philosophical reset.
That's a tough line to gauge from the outside sometimes. But for Justin Osborne and the shift to Susto, it feels like the music itself became the direct exploration of that intense fear that's Susto, the condition of the soul.
Yeah, they took what they perceived as a failure, or maybe that life of sin, and they managed to use it as the launch pad for what seems to be their most artistically sustainable and arguably most successful chapter yet.
So the final takeaway for you, the listener, might be about the incredible power, the potency of turning difficult personal history into public art.
Right. This story really seems to prove that the deepest cuts, those really honest confrontations with your own past, your own morality, your own fears, they can ultimately become the sharpest, the most resonant, and maybe even the most successful source material for the art that comes next. It suggests that artistic maturity sometimes is born from a kind of profound self-rejection first,